Welcome back to Between the Levees. I am joined today by Mr. Mike Hagan, a leader in the barge line industry for over 30 years. Mr. Hagan started as a management trainee in 1970 and worked his way up the ladder until he became president of the largest U.S. barge line in 1990. His foresight also led to many significant changes in the barge industry, including an array of topics which we will get into as we go here. But gentlemen, first and foremost, Mr. Mike Hagan, thank you for joining me, and Mr. Jim Fox, thank you for lining all this up. Well, so we're joined today. I've been sort of begging on Facebook lately for a guest host, so some assistance on this project, as it's been swallowing up most of my life. But these usually begin with where you were born, sir. So please start from the beginning, fill me in as much detail as you'd like up until you arrive in our lovely industry here.
Okay, I have some notes, which I'm famous for. When I used to give a lot of speeches, having a good outline, slides and everything else, which after the first 3 minutes, I was completely off on something else.
I'm not that high tech on this little podcast. And I did want to bring up too, you mentioned this morning, Google actually had some bad information.
I use it. I'm not sure I'm even bothered to learn much more about ChatGPT. It's quite outstanding, or what's capable, what the capabilities are. Sorry, for Google. So, well, first of all, I was born in Owensboro, Kentucky, a good river town, at where there was old Locking Dam 46, which is long gone after they changed to high-rise dams on the Ohio River. But I was born 46. My father was a World War II vet. He ran the National Guard unit in Owensboro after coming out of World War II as an artillery battery commander. He'd been a seminarian, so every now and then you might hear some Latin. You won't hear any of the Greek that he learned, but I got chewed out in both languages when I was a kid. Again, he was a civil engineer. My mom was born in Alabama. We actually met during the war, and she was a homemaker. I don't know why she didn't have a full-time other job, because we only had 8 kids. I was second oldest, 7 boys and 1 girl. So that was kind of that. My wife and I were grade school sweethearts in a Catholic school system, which was exploding. We're both leading edge baby boomers, born in 1946, as I said. I grew up in the Catholic school system, grades 1 through 12. Had lots of nuns back in those days. Got, I think, a really good foundation, which was good because my later academic career was not that stellar. I went to a local Catholic college called Brescia University. Now it was Brescia College back then, small Catholic liberal arts college. As you might imagine, being second oldest of 8 kids, I had to work my way through school. And I kind of worked full-time, part-time, and no time. I flunked out of Brescia College after a couple of years. I had a lot of fun when I was about that age. I kind of paid for it with an elongated college education. The saving grace was, and I'm not particularly bragging, it is what it is. I did end up eventually serving several terms on the board of trustees for Brescia. So they let me back in the door eventually, and so I went from flunking out to the dean's list because I grew up. My childhood sweetheart, that again was from grade school, her name is Michelle. She also went to Brescia. She was a year behind me in school. We're about 4 months difference in ages, which put us in different grades. I put in my notes here the problems I had going to school, which gets demonstrated when I'm trying to hold a straight line conversation. Was I said I was ADD before it was cool, but as before Ritalin came along, I could have gotten out of school a lot quicker. See what else I did make a few notes.
What did you study in school?
I was a business admin student. that Brescia was great for me. I ended up going, actually the highest average I had, I was taking 20 semester hours, 21, I think it was, and working virtually full time. My wife and I got married when we were 20. I guess the rest of the bio for this part was my first child, Holly, was born in the fall of 1970. We've been married about 3 years. And she was a little bitty squirt when I moved to Jeffersonville for ACL. Excuse me, sorry about that.
Well,
bleep all this out later.
That's all. It can all be cleaned up in editing, or I might just leave it for good measure. But you said you were the second oldest of 8. Did any of your siblings follow you into the industry or into the military like your father?
Well, yes. My older brother, George, was in the Army for 3 years. He was stationed in Germany for a while. And that is an interesting thingy for me is he was visited the town. My father was a major when he exited active duty, and then was promoted to unit to lieutenant colonel, and then again ran the National Guard unit in Owensboro. But the town in Germany where the Buchenwald death camp was, my father was the military administrator for the little town, and I don't recall the name of it, where that death camp was. And guys like him talk very little bit about World War II, but he had a few stories about dealing with people that had been involved in the death camp. Dad was 6'6" and weighed about 240, and could be rather forceful sometimes. So I guess only thing kept me out of jail when I was a teenager. But I always thought that was quite a learning thing to have him talk about that a little bit. I know that's an aside, but anyway, Rusty, we called him, was in the Army, and then my brother Steve, under me, was in the Army, served in Vietnam. He actually was a broadcaster also. And then my brother John, who was in the birth order, was after my one sister. So there was Steve, and then Beverly was her name. And then John was an ordnance disposal expert. He is still working in that field in Florida. I said always, if I got mad enough at anybody, I could just get John to blow their house up. He was a career military guy, was all over the world, and still travels globally on testing systems. You know, they'll go out and blow something up and take a bunch of measurements. So he was a military guy also. The only reason I didn't serve was when you go to school and you're ADD, you take 20 semester hours, and you're married and you're working almost full time, you end up with ulcers, which I did, which has been a kind of an issue my whole life, but we've managed around it. So yeah, we had a lot of people in the family were military people.
Okay, and how many children did you have? Did you think 8 was 8 too many?
Well, yeah, physically for sure. Yeah, my older daughter, Holly's her name. She was born 70, and then my son followed 3 years and a day later. He lives here in Louisville. His wife was running a small business, which we purchased actually 11 years ago. It's actually a beauty supply business. It's a natural link, from barging and shipbuilding and all that stuff to the beauty supply business. But anyway, I bought it, and then I have the idea of passing that along to them eventually. My son works in the business, and my daughter-in-law runs it. she's a superstar, my daughter-in-law. And so then we had a 13-year gap. And then when I called the princess, Natalie was born. We call her, I've got 6 grandchildren. We call Natalie's youngest Princess Junior, a little girl. So we've got, my older daughter had 2 children, and then my son didn't have any for quite a while, and then so they have 2, and my daughter Natalie also has 2, boy and a girl each. Just went to the 11th birthday party for my 11-year-old granddaughter, so that lives here in Louisville. So I have 2 in Louisville, 2 in Richmond, Virginia, and 2 grandchildren here, rather in Lexington. So,
Well, good for you, sir.
yeah,
Before my next, did you have something?
no.
So, but before my next question, or to lead into the questions that Mr. Fox has prepared, I'd like to ask you, Jim, uh, when did you first meet Mr. Hagan? What was that? What was going on in the business at the time? How did that relationship begin?
Yeah, I think the first time I really met Mike was somewhere around 1987 when he had just come back from the CSX. We had been bought by ACBL. We were the first company. We'll talk about the expansion and Mike's work in the expansion of the business where they actually did a lot of consolidation of the companies and things. And somewhere around 86, 87 in that time, Mike came back and I met him at that time. And I was teasing the other day, I always tried to be early into work so that I get a head start on everybody, and being the new kid on the block coming from St. Louis over to Louisville, trying to make an impression on everybody and everything. And sure enough, I'd be in my office and here come Mike. He'd already been there and had 2 or 3 cups of coffee and was going around saying hi to everybody. So Mike Hagan was a hard man to outwork, I'm just going to tell you.
Yeah, that's why I feel great.
Well, before we get in again, we'll transition into Jim's questions, and I will happily
Okay.
sort of step aside. But from finishing college or how did you find your way in the industry? I guess we'll start there.
Yeah, that goes back to the Owensboro ties. Texas Gas Transmission Corporation was a New York Stock Exchange traded company that kind of unusually, but they were headquartered in Owensboro. There was a gas pipeline system starting in Louisiana, came up the lower Mississippi, cut across the Ohio River, pretty well paralleled the river valleys, and they were a gas transmission business. So they owned ACL back, I think it was 77 or 8. And and then my father-in-law worked for the retail gas distributor in Owensboro, Western Kentucky. I joke about it, but I really was a big goofball for several years in school. But when I got out, by that time I was making good grades and I tested okay, and I wanted to get an MBA, and we went out. I was kind of looking, I couldn't get that in Owensboro at that time. Again, this is 1970, kind of in the spring. And so my in-laws had taken us to dinner, and we met a guy that worked at Texas Gas that my father-in-law knew. And they said, well, this is Mike, and looking to, he's finished school and wants to pursue an education, and he'll have to work. And so Louisville was one of the places I was considering. And he says, how about one of our companies? And I said, oh, who are they? And one of those businesses was ACBL. And so one thing led to another. I got an interview with Floyd Blasky, who was running the ACBL, well, really ACL, the holding company at that time. And one thing led to another, and I ended up getting an offer to job as a management trainee. What appealed to me about the job was I was supposed to be moved around into different departments before I settled into any one area. And so that really appealed to me. I guess it kind of fit my personality. We get a lot of variety. It was a terrific way to start because I did get moved around in some areas that stayed with me. Frank, in some cases, gave me advantages through my whole career. Again, we'll get into some of the things I was involved in, but so that's how I ended up there. And you know, kids weren't as mobile in those days, bouncing around jobs. So I always felt like, you know, it was a great place to start, and we'll see what happens. And I was very fortunate that every time I really thought about moving on, something popped up. So anyway, I had a great career, and it was a great company.
Well, tell me a little bit about Bill Blasky and AC Lines as you knew it back in the 70s.
Well, his name was Floyd. He was my predecessor's predecessor. And there was, it really ties in with the narrative about the consolidations. You know, consolidations didn't just start in the 70s or 80s or 90s. There was a company called Blasky Lines that Floyd's family owned. I guess Floyd was running it. I don't recall at all how many barges they had. I just remembered when I was dispatching, you know, the prefix on barges like ACBL. I think Ingram's is ING maybe. We had some barges that were still operating that were BL prefixes. So BL and then a number. And so that's how Floyd got into the business. ACL itself was a company called Butcher Arthur. Any of the old coots that are watching this will probably remember a guy named Jake Hershey. Jake was one of the guys that was involved in the original ACL before the sale to Texas Gas. But Jake was, for good reason, was an extremely well-known guy in the waterways. I had the privilege of meeting him a few times. Anyway, a senior moment, but that was anyway, that Floyd, when ACL was formed, and Floyd ended up being the CEO of that, and he was the head of ACL. Jake Hershey and another guy that used to be named a company called Butcher Arthur, and Dale Butcher was also, Jim may remember the boat we had named,
Oh, yes.
2000, I think, named Dale Butcher. Those guys moved to Houston, and actually the ACL headquarters for a while was in Houston. And then eventually all that, Dell and anybody else, they had a little bit of staff in Houston. That was all merged into Jeffersonville. And that was all done pre-me, although Jake Hershey, again, was a bit of a presence in the company as late as 1970. He was still involved as an industry advocate, and he was a fairly influential guy along the Texas coast. So,
Well, let me ask this final question, then I'll do my best to step aside and let this carry on as has been planned. But walk me through your experience with AC Lines up until your involvement with a sort of state-of-the-art costing system.
well, I started again. The thought was, you know, we won't call you anything that with semi-permanence in terms of a position for a couple of years. So I started in distribution services, which is dispatching, and I was telling Jim, we were having some conversations about this experience that I always thought that was a great place to start in the business because you interface with all the departments. You had a lot of conversations with the sales department and learned about the different commodities. Sometimes they had situations where customers were making demands or needed some help. And so there was a lot of interface with the sales department and what was driving that side of the business. I also remember the guy that ran the shipyard was the number 2 guy in ACL named Wes Nay.
Yeah.
Wes, I learned from him. He was kind of my shepherd for a while as a management trainee, but he always had a button on, says nothing happens till somebody sells something. So again, I got some exposure early on to that business as a dispatcher. I know Jim's done some dispatching. He probably would remember some of the same thing. We had to interface with crew dispatching on schedules because, had to get people on and off the boats. Also a lot of customer interface. The name Dan Markowitz is well known in the business. Dan ended up working with us for a while from Valley, but I used to talk to Dan almost every day in St. Louis when we were both young and had, well, Dan's kept some of his hair, but I had a lot of dark hair back in those days. But he was working for Bungay, and we were chartering barges that had to do with the regulatory regime, which is a totally different topic. But I got to know people in the industry, but also got to understand what operations needs were, work with barge maintenance, boat maintenance, because of when you could pull a boat in and out of service or a barge in and out of service, and again, scheduling maintenance. We also, as dispatchers, we generated the information for the accounting systems. So all the barge and boat hour accounting was originated by the dispatchers, putting into a handwritten record system where you recorded all the transactions. So, and you learned the geography. You had to know mile points and where the locks and dams were. So again, you learned an awful lot about the river system itself, which helped me. To this day, I can tell you a lot more about the Ohio River and the lower and the intercoastal waterway than I can the Illinois and the upper. I can tell you a little bit about them, but I dispatched those territories or was responsible for them directly in a line job somewhere in my career. So, but yeah, it was a great place to start in the business. And actually, when we hired people in at ACL, I had a prejudice for giving them at least some exposure to that department. So, you'd learn how different capacities of towboats, what you could do with the 5,000 and so forth. So, I was laughing with Jim and with the 760 horsepower boats we ran with 4 barges on intercoastal back in those days.
You said 760 with a 4-pack?
Yep.
What were those tows?
A little bit of everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
What were the regulation barges like today, or?
Yeah. 195 to 35s or 200s and tankers, and obviously some of it was condition based. I learned things which I don't know what statute of limitations about it. I guess it was legal, but sometimes if those boats would get windbound, if they could, they'd back up and just drag the barges and let them get blown into the bank, and you just pull them along until you hit something that was crossing the bank to try to at least make some miles. But
were they stuck with all empties?
Everything. They were the core canal operating boats, as best I remember. I'm sure, like any other call it broadcaster, probably be 50 people commenting on your podcast to say, "Oh, he's nuts," but they were 760s.
Oh yes, they were.
When we switched to 1,800 horsepower boats, more was better.
Indeed. Well,
in the Houston area, yeah.
I know, Mr. Fox, the first question on his list here was about this accounting system. So I'd kind of like to let him frame up what that was, and then we'll get into your involvement with it.
Okay.
Yeah, Tim, let me just say, Tim, I want to thank you for this opportunity to share with Mike here and include me as part of this podcast for a couple reasons. One, I find Mike Hagan to be just a significant part of the barge line history. Like I said, for almost 35 years, he's been involved in this. Like myself, I started in '69 as a night watchman. I think I told on my podcast Mike, the same thing in 1970. So a lot of history and a lot of water under the bridge, so to speak, between the two of us. And what's really interesting is because I was outside of ACBL for the first half of my career, working for Barge Line on the Missouri River, which I know every mile point and have been up down the Missouri River for a long time, all the way to New Orleans. I, like Mike, was able to learn a lot. I was a dispatcher, I was a crew dispatcher, and then I moved into operations, which Mike moved into sales. But I want to thank you, Tim, for letting us do this because I think Mike has a lot to bring to in the history of what's happened in the marine business, and he's just so full of knowledge. So I appreciate you giving him the opportunity to do this.
No problem at all. I thank you for bringing him to me.
Okay.
Well, we're not done yet. You
Yeah.
deserve your job.
With that said, Mike, we both remember trying to talk to towboats on single sideband radios. We both probably remember the first fax we ever saw on a fax machine. I remember being in Mr. Cole and a fax coming over, and I just blew my mind that you could get information from somebody else on a fax machine and in the Twix rooms and everything. And so the technology, when Mike and I both first started, was just as he said, most of it was by hand, and it was by a VHF radio if you could hear him. It was by somebody yelling on a single sideband and yelling back and forth. So, Mike, why don't you go into some of that and the history of that? Mike was even more involved in that than I was. I just used it. Mike helped develop some of that stuff.
Yeah, it was different. Yeah, as far as some of this all blend together. I know we're going to talk about watercom and communications a little bit, but I apologize. Ragweed is almost historically bad in the Louisville area right now. So that's given me a lot of trouble today. Nothing can go wrong other than getting hoarse when you're trying to do a podcast. But so what the dispatchers did, we communicated, we wrote the boat orders, pick this many up, drop that many, turn a boat. That means swapping flotillas by putting the right size boat in the right section of the river. All the records were paper. As Jim mentioned, the Twix room, it sounded like something out of an old movie, rat-a-tat-tat-tat with this stuff. And we produced boat reports that were called, or tow sheets were listings of what a boat had in its flotilla that had to be manually operated each day. We had pre-printed sheets with lines on it. The barge reports themselves, you get a report. They did have, I forget the name of them, but they were like carbon copies, but they didn't have carbons. I think we were advanced enough to have that carbon, multiple copies that had the carbon built in the paper. So you had these blue sheets. So you call a customer and they tell you when a barge finished. So you put finished load or finished unload, the repair yard, finished repair. But you would write it in over the top of the last location for that barge, because those barge reports were sorted by location up and down the river system, canal system, and so forth. So somebody wanted, gosh, this is bad. I'm not sure we're going to get through this. The story I was telling Jim is that if somebody wanted to know where a specific barge was for some reason, the first thing you do is say, well, where was it the last time you knew where it was? And they said, well, it was on a tow going by Memphis. Well, that narrowed your search down. So you had to, dig through your tow sheets or somebody else's tow sheets. And same way with the barge and port. And so that was a state of the art for communications. As far as communications with the vessels, one interesting thing about ACL and Texas Gas, one of the companies in the ACL family was a company called Bauer Dredging. Bauer Dredging did dredging along the inland system, a lot in the Gulf Coast, but they had dredges in Africa. And so we had a radio station, and again, all the old coots watching this will remember WFN. They were a marine radio system operating over channel 16 on the waterways. That was a frequency allocation for inland waterways. They were pretty limited in number. But but we ran, one of the things that ACBL was different about, we were a lot more, before I joined through WFM, again, they could talk to those dredges in Africa. We would run 6 schedules a day. So a single sideband wasn't the best clarity in the world, a lot of interference. But all the captains, would drive them crazy to listen to that all the time. So you couldn't really call them. If you had a between schedule call, you'd try to reach them on VHF, and you had to pay for those calls. But the captains had a set time that they were to turn their radios on, the single sideband radios. We were actually running 6 a day, so that the boat was not out of touch with the home office for too long. So if there were orders, changes, and stuff like that, it could be done. So I do think there was a propensity for information that started before my time. I think Joe Bobzien at that time in accounting was largely responsible for that. The cost system at ACL was very detailed. We knew where every barge, we thought we knew where every barge was every minute, and the same with the boat and what they were doing. But again, in that, the cost accounting system, all the information was pulled off of these updated barge reports today and put on a little index card. And all that stuff got key punched. So they had barges in tow sheets or cards, and they had barge activity cards. And all of that fed barge activities. Actually, it was a punch card system in the early days. It was fed in so they could produce their barge hour accounting system. They had worked with an industry consortium and some economists to develop something called an EBM, which stood for equivalent barge mile, which actually measured work. One EBM was one barge, one rake barge moving 1 mile down on the lower Mississippi River, loaded to, I think it was 9 feet. And so if you came back up the lower Mississippi with the same barge empty, that would be about 0.7 EBMs. But it was an attempt to measure work. And I know some other barge lines, I believe, used EBMs. I wasn't aware of that for a long time, but anyway, that was atomic element, if you will, for barge hour accounting and boat hour accounting, back in that period. So when I was dispatching, I got moved around a lot. Somebody took a vacation in Pittsburgh. They sent me up to relieve him for vacation and stuff, partly to round my experience out as a so-called management trainee. The business was getting big enough. The manual processing of information was crazy. ACBL did have a computer. It was a batch processing, actually an IBM 360, but they couldn't do any online processing. That was usually reserved for much bigger companies, but we were searching around for some way, and my superiors were, and frankly I was too, said there's got to be a better way to do this. I had one computer class in college, and we didn't even have a computer, but it was had one programming course. It was a theoretical programming language, and I told Jim, I said, after flunking out of school, the first A I got in college was classical logic. I'm not bragging, that was the only thing. I had some capacity in that part of my pea brain. And it was one of the few times in my life anybody asked me for help with their homework, trying to figure out some of the case problems in classical logic. And then again, I had the programming class, and I had the same thing happen. So I started asking a few questions myself about, couldn't we do this or that way? And again, the company was beginning to talk about it. And next thing I knew, I moved into an office with a guy named Don Peters. and began to look at how we could automate all that dispatching and data collection system. We stumbled on, actually, Don, who always knew far more than I did. He's very talented. He ran all the systems and programming, but we shared an office. And a computer sales guy came in, and I'll cut through all of it. There was a system out there in those days. When I tell people what I originally programmed on, they look at me like I'm nuts. I said I worked on a gasoline-powered computer called a Singer System 10. And but what made it neat was it was very low cost, and it actually did time sharing. So the end result was you could hook a bunch of dispatchers up, including in New Orleans, to what was called a CRT in those days, which was cathode ray tube, because there weren't no flat screens. Again, that was the state of the technology, but actually very effective. And because I knew barge operations, dispatching, barge and boat movements and so forth, I ended up going to a programming class. It was assembler language, which is a step above machine language. We would actually patch programs in machine language sometimes if they wasn't too complicated. But as a result of that, I had to dig into the cost system, which I didn't have that much exposure to. And that was a big boost in my career. But I had to make sure that everything we were doing manually at that stage with cost accounting, we were able to capture and automate the production of all the output that was needed. ACBL in the very early days had something that was called a commodity report, which was short for profit and loss by commodity group. And so they mashed all the cost accounting stuff together and produced a profitability report by movement of each barge trip. And again, there weren't too many people in the industry who were doing that, and that was all done manually. Again, Joe Bobzien deserves the credit for all of that development and the fact that it was done fairly early for the industry. So I learned, and it's not bragging, it's just because of the opportunity I had. Sorry about this. You can hopefully you can bleep all this coughing. I knew more about the cost system outside of anybody that had worked in the cost system. And so I used to drive the cost people nuts later on when I was in sales because we were costing different moves. But again, that was a big advantage to me and frankly improved my understanding of the innards of a barge company. And again, boat expenses were a part of that. So we developed the online system for the industry. We had Jim mentioned coming in early, but work ethic with ACL in Maine was pretty strong. I arrived that way. When we were developing that system, and I learned a program. The idea was that I was going to tell them what reports they need. So I said, well, here's first you got to input this stuff. You're going to need to know, you probably ought to have something like a bad order report for barge repairs. And so that could be scheduled. And you got to know when barge is loaded or unloaded. You got to trigger all the billing. So all that stuff was embedded in there. And so I was going to provide that information and help design a bunch of that stuff. I did all the mnemonics like FLD. You had to be very careful because memory was so precious that, so if you look, and I don't know what ACBL is still using today, but the reason the codes were 3 was that that was the smallest number of mnemonics that you could use and still have everybody understood could understand after some training what it meant. So FLD again was finish loading. LDG was barge loading, so I still remember most of those. So I did all that kind of stuff. I ended up doing a lot of programming. And also did the early testing. I actually had to do all the updating myself once we had a system that was ready for testing operationally. I was telling Jim, in those days when you had the manual reports, you could actually lose a barge, especially with a big fleet. And I actually found, I don't know, several barges because we had a barge could get dropped off through a typographical error or something off of one of those old barge reports. And they would eventually show up, actually the barge cost system, which always ran behind, would eventually see a barge sitting there and they go ask about it and say, well, I ain't seen it, but eventually track it and find it. Well, we loaded all the barges down. Of course, that was one of the first things we did was load the fleet into the computer. Obviously it was a disk file in those days, but I actually found, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 barges at Cairo because it kept showing up on my report, and the reports that the dispatchers were actually using to update, that they had been dropped off the report, so they were buried in our big fleet at Cairo. So I designed a bad order report. I keep referencing Jim, but we talked about some of the stuff. Barge maintenance guy was one of the first converts. When I moved through the different departments, asking an awful lot of questions to work on designing a system, people looked at me like a space alien. I remember some people said, well, he's some kind of efficiency expert, because that was starting to become the rage in corporate America. But a lot of people said, well, we just can't do this. A lot of people are scared to death to touch a computer. It seems strange now when my granddaughter, who's 6, FaceTimes me all the time. Again, it was a different world, but anyway, sorry, again, senior moment.
No, was that the beginning of, I think it was the integrated barge information system, that IBA system that I fell into in 2016?
Yeah, that was exclusively done by ACBL. I finally, like I usually do, bring myself back full circle. Was talking about there were 2 of us that were devoting I was almost full-time on the system. And Don, who was an excellent programmer, worked on that a lot, even though he's also manager of all the other programming efforts, but there were, sub-managers for different areas of that. And we actually had a key to the cafeteria. So we would work all day, go to the cafeteria and fix sandwiches while my poor family was at home, and work till we couldn't anymore. And that system was designed when we kind of had it up testing mode. We let other companies come in and look at it. And again, this is one of my tall tales that's true, but I remember when Oracle came in and they asked our chief financial officer at that time, whose responsibility ultimately the systems development fell. He was brother of Don Peters. And this guy, by the way, Ken Peters, was one of the best analyst I ever worked on. He wasn't a programmer analyst, but just analyst. Ohio River Company was looking at the system they were demonstrating, and they asked Kenny, what size staff do you have devoted to this? And he said, I have probably about 1.7. I said, you're what? Some of it had to do with the machine also, but I thought that I even wired the coax cables at night so it wouldn't disrupt the operations, coming in, lifted the ceiling tiles in the offices and snaked these cables in where we could start distributing these CRTs around the office. And that's how I ended up in New Orleans, because I went down to New Orleans to train the staff down there and install the machines. So that was how, again, I got involved in all that stuff. But a lot of that system remained the system through a long period of time. It was changed as the technology enabled a lot more robust processing. But the core of what a dispatcher was looking at, it had a lot better tools. It was much faster and so forth. The development even then was getting easier as far as programming language. I mean, this assembler is, I mean, this down at bits and bytes, and it's very tedious, but it's very demanding. But people that know me and said could still to this day can't believe I was ever an assembler programmer because I always bounced off the walls. But so the systems changed a lot, but again, I have no idea what a screen looks like over there. But and even while I was there, we were rewriting the systems, obviously, because again, the dramatic changes, like the difference. We wrote programs in 10K partitions. And I mentioned it was a time sharing machine, and I know I'm getting in the weeds, but it was memory was so important as memory became a lot more available, then the robustness of the systems improved with it.
One quick question for you. I'll ask it and please feel free to begin answering. I'm going to step away for just a minute. I'll be right back, but
Okay.
Feel free again. We're recording, so this will all be good. So with all these advancements in technology over the years, how important was the connection with the captains of these boats? Like think back to your dispatching days, and over those years, the technology sort of create a distance between dispatcher and captain.
You'd think, but my answer is no. Actually, it improved the communications clearly, and a lot of the robustness that over time developed in the office also happened on the boats. So yeah, we did a lot of training. We eventually, after WaterCom was developed, all the boats had computers. That was a major hurdle to overcome. I mentioned people being scared of computers. There was a cultural barrier, probably more than in the office. I mean, I went out on the boats and they said, "What do you mean we're going to be operating a computer?" Because the boat captains would input the data. You remember any of that, Jim? I'm going to ask you a question.
Yeah, yes, I do remember that. And I remember that boat captains were wanting assistance because a lot of the boat captains, quite frankly, didn't spend a lot of time in school. They spent their time out on the river, and they were very intimidated by the very thought of me on a computer. And but I think the technology that Mike has developed and came along, as you were saying, it really enhanced the whole system. Once the boat captains found out how much easier their work was, that they could actually tell and they could actually send information back into the office about how to design your tow, so that instead of having a dispatcher in the office that probably had little knowledge of tow design and stuff, you had a boat captain that could communicate with him and said, "Why don't you put this load here, or this, face this barge up like this." And once they found out what tool it was to help them with their job, it became a lot easier to sell to them.
Yeah. That was, again, it was an interesting development, but in the very earliest stages, it was just people didn't.
It was a hard sell.
Be able to operate a computer. It was just, again, totally different times. It's astounding how far we've come since those days.
Yeah. And Mike, I guess, just looking at your resume that I had seen and doing it, I guess you spent, I mean, it sounds like something that this wasn't done overnight. This took you a considerable amount of time to put this together, right?
Yes, it did. I mean, it's very tedious and time consuming. And I forget, on I'm gonna look at my notes because with all else, I'm old. Yeah, 75. I guess I was involved in that for 2-3 years. I was doing some other stuff also, but in keeping with my distribution services stuff. But that did lead me ultimately to New Orleans when I went out and had an operating job. The other thing we had, Jim and I, for those watching whatever part of this you're actually watching, is we kind of did some outlines in advance to say, well, what do we want to talk about? But one of the things, and I had it down as one of my major events, and it was a great enabler, was the development of communication system. I'm leaping ahead, but when I was appointed assistant to the executive vice president at ACL, there was an industry group called Watercom that was trying to get frequency allocation for the inland waterways. A lot of the VHF channels had been stolen by the railroad systems. They were allocated to waterways, but they weren't being used. And so for local operations, the railroad system, a lot of those channels were used. They were in, down the weeds, 160 megahertz, which meant you had good propagation, which you needed on the river system, because it's always the most hostile environment for communications, because it's always the low point. Sorry, sound like I'm an auctioneer, but that was a challenge for communications in the waterways. And so this industry group was looking, they knew there was they called it World Administrative Radio Conference that was coming up, and they were going to make a pitch for, they couldn't get the VHF frequencies back to the industry because they were so embedded in the railroad systems. And so but they were in a higher frequency band, which was a little harder, but they were still VHF. Cell phone systems are right up against light because they're very, very high frequency, and they're almost line of sight. So they thought this frequency would work. So there was a group, a consortium that was starting to try to work with some consultants and all to get an allocation of frequencies. So that's where the guy named Ray Spence came into the picture. He'd been a chief scientist for the FCC, but the ACBL had chosen, for whatever reason, maybe arrogance, not to participate in that industry group. But I was asked, my boss was an EVP. I was asked to go to a meeting in St. Louis, and so like a lot of stuff, he said, why don't you go over to this meeting with these guys? There are a number of industry leaders in the meeting, and one of the guys I'll remember was actually Bob Gardner's the name. A lot of the old coots will remember. But they were talking about how they were going to build the system. It's going to be expensive. They didn't know what a system meant. Really, I mean, there was no design as such. It's going to cost a lot of money. And Frank Steakbuyer, who was Southern Company's CEO, nice business out of Memphis. Frank looked over at me, dumb kid, and said, he said, hell, let ACBL build it. They got plenty of money. And so Frank came up to me. I just nodded. Believe it or not, I did know how to keep my mouth shut back then, even now if I have to. But Frank walked up and he said, you're thinking about that, aren't you? And I said, well, we'll see. And so I went back to Jeffersonville and I said, this is something I think we should look at. And because we were trying ourselves to solve that problem. I should also mention we were still owned by Texas Gas. Communications was a big deal for a pipeline company, and they did a lot of remote sensing, stuff like that. And they had frequency allocation. They had a big engineering department with the communications division, and we were able to borrow a lot of help. So anyway, we started looking at Watercom and ended up building the system in the 216 to 220 megahertz range. Had a lot of stations up and down the river. It also would handle voice and data. And of course, data was still unheard of, transmitting anything to the boats. So that's kind of where Watercom came in. And but that's really water came into being, and that was a project of mine. I worked with a lot of communications law firms and involved in answering some issues around communications, given my earlier background when I mentioned working in systems and programming and so forth. And so I stayed with that as a project up until it was ready to go into becoming a real business, hiring and completing the design, a lot of testing and hiring people and the staff and so forth. I was asked if I wanted to run it, and I said no. Frankly, I really like the inland waterway business, and so I stayed as an assistant too, and went on to other things. So
yeah, Mike, it was a major change in how business was done between towboats and the office and things like that. The Watercom system was, and we kind of laughed about the other day that a lot of the other barge lines were concerned that ACBL was going to develop this so they could steal information from the other barge lines and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and you have to think back to where computers were, but several of them were just adamant that ACBL can't be the sole operator of this system. And I said, we'll let you look at any of it you want to, first of all. And I said, if we know where all your boats and barges are, who cares? I said, what are you going to do with the information? I said, frankly, if we want to know where all your boats and barges are, and I remember saying at the time, I said, we can get a couple of small airplanes and in a day we can fly the whole river system and we can count them. We can fly low. And I remember flying in a seaplane under all the bridges in New Orleans.
I think, Mike, one of the big points of that, it indicates as the whole river association group and everybody, technology was just this thing out there that people were afraid of until you actually saw it working and what it could do for you, and that made a huge difference. Watercom was a huge factor in the barge line business at that time.
Yeah, I remember asking a question, including Ray Spence, who was a very sharp guy, and we borrowed an engineer named Dale Walford. Dale was kind of the mad scientist that was actually on our payroll. I think he stayed on Texas Gas payroll, and we did some transfer pricing for pension reasons and others. And I think he did end up going back to Texas Gas. I'm not sure. It's a long time ago. But first of all, I don't want to leave the impression that we weren't the only ones working in the arena. I do think we were first, and I give Joe credit for a lot of that. At some point I felt like I helped. Some of it was just a matter of having the opportunity to do it, and maybe some of it was the way my mind worked. But again, there were other people visiting the system. But when it got to be a real business, and I was responsible for it, I'd always say, what's the lifespan? Because we always knew that it would be someday technologically obsolete. And of course, cell phones, actually, Ray Spence was involved in testing the early cell phones. They tested them around DC because of all the hills and the tunnels. And so they were looking for a hostile environment. And of course, the Federal Communications System had gazillions of people there, and which Ray was responsible for. And again, he was originally the industry's find. I give our people credit for being smart enough to hire him, but the industry had found him in that group that I talked about that was meeting in St. Louis. But in any event, they usually tell me like 10 years, I think we were surprised at the rapid build out cell phone system, because again, that river is a very hostile place for communications. And then, you know, now you've moved on from cell phones to satellites. And even there, we found this on several continents, but particularly the United States, even satellites, when a towboat's hidden by a hillside, you know, when you look out the window to the south and you're where most of the satellites are parked, and you're looking up at a big bluff over on the upper or someplace like that, you probably ain't gonna be able to use your satellite either. Although again, that's changing too. There's so many of them buzzing around up there. So
There's a couple things, I think, more things in the technology side. We got a lot more I would like to get to with you, and so I'd like to move this on just a little bit, but I would like for you to touch on a couple more things, if you would, on the technology side. And before you do that, you've mentioned the name Joe Bobzien before. Of course, I knew Joe because I worked with him, and he was a really, really exceptional man. How did Joe Bobzien fit into your career?
well, Joe, there aren't many people I owe as much to as I do Joe. But he was a treasurer when I started. And then when I moved out of dispatching particularly, he got to know me better. And then when Floyd became ill and Joe was the heir apparent and eventually became CEO, you know, I was around him a lot. The jobs I had gave me that exposure too. For a while, a guy named Bob Hard, who started off as an attorney, but Bob had some of the barging operations as EVP. But then things like coming back from the St. Louis meeting, I remember I got some feedback because I said I sat down with those guys and I said, you know, here's what I heard, and I think we ought to take a look at this, and gave them the reasons why. And Joe liked somebody that was plain spoken, and I never really knew how to be any other way. I probably sometimes would have been better off, but in any event, I got that exposure. And then Bob left, and I became Joe's assistant, and so I worked very closely with him. I was joking with Jim for this podcast audience. I said those assistant jobs are the best ones I ever had. I had no authority, no real authority. I had a lot of apparent authority. I had no direct reports. Nobody knew where I was or what I was supposed to be doing. And I got the direction I got was go and talk to these guys in St. Louis and see what they're open to and what they want. Come back and tell us about it. It was a great job. It was a lot of fun. It sort of suited my personality, but I worked closely with Joe. The other part of that is during one of the areas of responsibility I had was for strategic planning. I remember going to an American Management Association seminar on strategic planning, and so I got that exposure. You know, we always did an annual plan, and as part of that was trying to say what are the new things in the business that we could do differently. Obviously, we used a lot of consultants too for that. What was the outlook for the various commodity segments in the business and so forth, and that was all part of my learning. But I'd have to put together. Again, I mentioned Ken Peters earlier. Ken was a great help because he was such a good systems guy. And putting those more long range plans together with all the top management at the company participating again in an annual seance. So that's how I got to know Joe. And then I left that job. It suits me to keep bouncing around. I left that job. Actually, a guy named Ed Peterson ran the sales department, and Ed left the company. I actually formed a brokerage operation with Dan Markowitz and Ed Peterson. and a guy named Dan Barker, who had also worked for ACL in sales for a while. And they said, well, we need a new vice president of sales. And they kind of looked around and said, well, Hagan didn't do anything. So I was made vice president of sales. And so like Forrest said, I took to that like a duck to water. And so I became the sales guy. And again, and what was for me relevant was almost everything I had done to that point helped me in the sales business. I knew customers, I knew the cost accounting, I knew what movements cost. When I work on a rate, I'd get the cost guys together and I actually understood what they were saying mostly. And ACBL had some outstanding people in that area. So anyway, I still call them those young guys. They're all retired. So everything's relative.
Mike, let me ask you one more question about the system things, and then we're going to move on to something else, if I may. You also were instrumental in even on the towboat side on system developments, and I think in particular one of them was when we all went through the huge oil shortage, and all of a sudden fuel became the driving influence in the barge line. Can you address that, please?
Yeah. I remember. Actually, I looked this up for a refresh my memory, but I think it was, I want to say August maybe, but anyways, 1973 was the first Arab oil embargo. And that was an interesting time where the cost exploded. You know, everybody that's old enough will remember the long lines to get gasoline. The guy that ran Texas Gas in those days, his name was Bill Elmer, and Joe was in his job. He said one of the orders that Bill Elmer gave was, "You guys run out of fuel, you'll be out of here." And that's when ACBL really got in, began the process of more intensified fuel management. Business. I think I may still be a little early for some of the stuff, but and having robust systems were and all the communication systems is all a part of that. But I know, and I don't take any credit for hiring these guys, but we hired some people that actually done work on helping submarines run quiet, but they were engineers and knew a lot about vessels, not river vessels, but they had all sorts of pretty exotic skill sets, and they were hired to help work on optimizing towboat operations, and that's when we began to learn how to. And by the time I was in sales, that actually got to be an issue within the company because fuel was still very expensive and compared to what it was when I started in the business. And so we would vary the speeds of the towboats based on markets. You look at if you ran faster, you produced incremental capacity, and that incremental capacity, all markets are made at the margin. So you could sell those barges theoretically out in the marketplace at some margin. So how much additional margin were you creating by consuming fuel at a higher rate? And then when it went the other way, markets dropped or the fuel dropped. You rather went up further, you might slow the boats down further. So, and then of course that became a customer service problem. So I got involved in a lot of those arguments. Did you ever get involved in those, Jim?
Yes, and I was going to ask you, did you ever decide you're just going to tie the fleet up? It was too expensive and just let it sit for a while?
Oh yeah. That's a whole different vector. But yeah, Jim and I were talking a little bit about Armageddon, sort of the overbuilding that happened in 1980. Well, it came to a head, and and the market collapsed in 1982. But at one time in the barge business, because I remember ACBL did it, we had a divine right to the rate of return. So if the rates got below a level that we're going to produce a profit, I'm not talking about contribution, but maybe some of this audience would remember, they would tie the barges to the banks. Well, a lot of times that would make the rates go up, but they wouldn't operate below a certain level. And so I mentioned being in charge of strategic planning. You could see that there had been a dramatic deterioration. You could see it coming, I guess. That you could see rates. I remember got Continental Grain that went to he had an MBA. I call an MBA in a jar, executive MBA. And one of the truisms that he came out of that class with was that in a capital intensive business, barge company, when supply exceeds demand, prices rapidly fall to variable cost. And we didn't have any idea at the time that it was going to get that bad, but you could see some different pricing from what was historically there when, again, in response to that, the carriers would tie off. I put on the agenda at our strategic planning meeting, how far should we go with variable cost pricing? And I think nobody in the group, including me, really had ever had much exposure to variable cost pricing, because it was just a different way of looking at the world. Yeah, that was interesting, because and all that changed. You know, at one point we learned, I used to preach that too. I said, when people talking about tying barges off, they said, I've laughed. I heard people later on in my career or post-career talking about about disciplining the marketplace. I said, yeah.
Yeah, Mike, I think one of the comments that I would ask you about what you just said. I think ACBL was one of the few companies that really kind of maintained their position. You had to make a certain amount of capital to recover your capital and your things and everything. And what happened that I remember clearly is all of a sudden you had doctors, dentists, all these other people that had money, didn't know what to do with it. They put in the barge line business. They were going to make all this money because rates were high for a while there, and people were going to make. And so we overbuilt the industry just tremendous. Could you speak to that, especially in light of the fact you had your own shipyard?
That was interesting debate internally also. But yes, Jim, it's rightfully pull me back a little bit on the path here. Again, those are old enough, saw massive overbuilding. We used to give talks on it constantly. In those days, the tax code allowed passive earnings like income from leasing barges to be used to offset earned income. So a lot of barge pools were put together, doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs would invest in. A lot of brokerage firms put these consortiums together, and a lot of it was all about the tax advantages. And it looked great, and you know, it was just the sky's the limit on this stuff. I mean, the barge business had been a pretty steady business forever, right? So what could go wrong? And I think the last year of the boom, 2,000 barges were built. I think Jeff Boat built actually 600. But later when I'd be careful about antitrust laws, but I just commented sometimes to people that accelerated depreciation is not your friend, and because people would say, well, I need to build some barges because I got to pay taxes. But those barge pools and the overbuilding was so drastic, and there's no way that that the business could be absorbed. And on top of that, there are other things going on that affect the business. The Clean Air Act had an impact. We used to move a ton of chrome ore to Memphis. They imported in the Gulf. Clean Air Act, poof, that was all shut down. A lot of other stuff like that, a lot of the processing of metals in the upper Ohio Valley shut down. So capacity had the Russian embargoes that helped put Brazil and Argentina in the grain business. So you had at the same time, you had this massive building taking place. And so, yeah, it was an ugly time. And because of the life of the equipment, it lasted forever. I was telling Jimmy that I took over sales in March of '82. And so in May, I think it was, Joe called me back to his office. And he looked down over his glasses and said, I'm looking at these revenue reports. He said, things are falling behind quite a bit. He said, that is sales job, isn't it? And I looked at him and I said, yeah. But I said, I said, it's you and Bob Green's fault because you built all those barges and sold them to all these people. Joe kind of blanched, but he'd been around me a lot, but not completely. And but he said, well, somebody was going to build them. And I said, I understand that. I said, you made a lot of money on them. The margins on those barges were crazy. And for a brief period, Jeff Boat's earnings were up close to the barge line, but it didn't last. But then the rates were really going into a free fall. And again, I don't think anybody realized it was going to last as long as it did. And again, the soft economy and the part of the 80s driven by further increases in fuel prices and so forth were also an element. But that Jim just had me. I had, when I marked down the 5 or 6 things in my career that were major, obviously the overbuilding of the barge fleet was one of those things that happened, and it affected everybody. There was resistance to. There was a part of the business that was regulated through the Waterways Freight Bureau, and that was the industry for a regulated product. Was something that could be counted, like sheets of steel, coils of wire, coils of steel, pieces of machinery, so forth. So non-fungible goods were regulated, and they moved under a tariff. And I still remember that some guys that I mentioned earlier that started a brokerage operation, one in particular, you could flag out of the tariff they were called pink sheets. And I started getting, because I got copies of the pink sheets. And first one, I remember the first one I ever saw, I don't remember what the movement was for, but people started flagging out of the tariffs, filing pink sheets with, they call it the WFB, or again, it was part of the Interstate Commerce Commission, or under their purview, which again, the ICC is no longer there. It's all falls under DOT. All of a sudden, pink sheets were a flurry, and that was all the margins being peeled out of the regulated freight. And eventually, all that freight became completely deregulated. Again, if you want a little ancient history in the business, about the time I came in, there used to be a segregation. You couldn't mix regulated and non-regulated freight. I think at one time even there were some restrictions over flotillas and what they can contain. But that part of it was gone by the time I started the business. So I may be imprecise in describing that, but again, eventually the Waterways Freight Bureau was dissolved. Anybody who follows the grain markets and grain pricing, everything is enumerated, the rates and as a percentage of tariff. And the industry tried to make grain regulated, but it just didn't fall under the rules. And there was a ruling that grain was not regulated. Actually, there was some antitrust inquiries over that process preceded me, but the tariff stayed as they had smart enough to change it to benchmark rates at one point instead of calling it tariff rates. But long after the tariff was disallowed, the term tariff was still used to describe rates.
So Mike, about that time when things were really bleak for all of us, it was a hard time in the industry for everybody, and
Oh, it was
people were
awful.
falling out, uh, and just about the time you think it couldn't get any worse from my point of view at SCNO and some of the other barge lines, all of a sudden, somebody at ACBL got this bright idea that CSX should come in and buy a barge line. And this was an interesting time because I would have bet my house that that would never happen because I knew a law that said a railroad cannot own a water carrier. And somehow, Mike, you were involved in all that. Would you like to enlighten us on that?
I'm innocent. Um, yeah, as Jim said, actually, I mentioned that Texas Gas was in Owensboro. CSX had gone through something called the Staggers Act, and again, I'll try to stay out of the weeds on that. It was just the railroads had been nationalized. I refer to it as a nationalization of the rail system through the regulatory process. And anybody watching this that likes regulations, I tell you, you're nuts because they'll always end up biting you in the rear end at some points. I like some of you that would remember Billy Harbison was a great guy. Everybody knew him. He was from Mississippi and had more of a drawl than me. He would say, I know how to spell Mississippi. I just don't know when to stop. And that's the way regulation works. So the railroads were actually all going busted. A lot of them went busted and reorganized. The Staggers Act had kind of changed the way railroads operated. There was still a lot of heartburn by the rails as to whether there was a real future. And part of the trouble was rail labor, which is still a mess, but not as bad as it used to be. They couldn't drop unprofitable lines and so forth. So Hayes Watkins was the chair. CSX was really looking at how do they do something in addition to the railroad business. And Texas Gas was a transportation company, pipeline. They also had an oil and gas exploration company down in Texas. And we were a barge company, a barge transportation. They had a couple, Texas Gas owned a couple truck lines also. So CSX was looking around and they ended up settling on Texas Gas and made a tender offer, and it was a friendly acquisition. And so they purchased Texas Gas. Something called the Panama Canal Act had been passed by Congress. It was a product actually, it wasn't really so much for the inland waterways. It was when they started having coast-to-coast railroads back in the 1800s. And there was a fighting ships theory, they were called, where the railroads would acquire ocean-going vessels, take freight around one way or the other, or coastally, and lower the rates and run the shipping companies out of business. And then all of a sudden their fleet got tied up, and so all the rail rates were lifted up. And so the legislation for the Panama Canal Act was to keep the railroads from basically killing off the Panama Canal by manipulating rail rates. And so they had this little clause that said that a water carrier may not own, a railroad may not own a water carrier with whom it does or may compete. And as Jim and I were talking, there were millions of dollars spent on figuring out what does or may compete meant. And we were placed in a voting trust. And ACL actually was an independent company technically owned by CSX, but CSX couldn't manage it. We couldn't talk to the guys at the railroad. We got some exemptions, because we had to, but we were in a voting trust until it was sorted out before the Interstate Commerce Commission, ultimately before an administrative law judge, as to what that meant. I was a new head of sales at ACL or ACBL. And so there was going to be this massive hearing. All the barge companies were up in arms because we were going to run out of their business. And to this day, I deeply regret that they were wrong, but it didn't happen. But at that time, everybody thought it would. And so we put this case together, and they knew they were going to need a marketing witness. And so they decided that Hagan should be the person to do that, because when he gets on a stand and they ask him a question, he can say, "I don't know," with great authority. And so a lot of people, if you've ever testified, and it can be everything from divorces to mergers and acquisitions, you answer the question that you were asked, and don't do like I'm doing on this podcast. You answer the question you were asking, you don't say any more than that. And then if you answer honestly. And so, and I ended up being woodshedded with a guy named Will Baumel, who had a dual professorship at Princeton and NYU, and he was a hired gun economist. So I spent weeks and weeks in Washington. Joe went with me on some of those soirees. And Joe ended up testifying, but I was scheduled for 8 hours, and they scheduled Joe for a very short time. He was a finance background and ran the business still, obviously at that time. But I was charged with again giving that testimony. And Baumel's theory was that a monopolistic business, if it acquires a purely competitive business, experiences no net gain in monopoly power. And nobody believed that. And even John Snow, who became chairman of CSX for a long time, and one of the most brilliant guys I ever worked around, and he was a lawyer and a PhD economist, and John was in some of the meetings. And John was a lot quicker than I was, and he picked it up. But I mean, there was some debate even around the table with some people who knew a lot more economics than I did, trying to figure that out. And but I learned more about the nature of competition and, frankly, some economics than I ever learned in school. And ultimately, the acquisition did go through. I got to know a lot of the railroad people, including John Snow. I remember asking Baumel, again, being plain spoken, I said, "Well, if your answer to that is correct," I said, "why in the hell are we sitting here?" So, and John looked at me and he said, "That is a good question." But,
So at the end of the day, Mike, the answer was that because that the railroad could not own a water carrier, technically there wasn't any competition, or it didn't offset the monopolistic portion of it. Is that correct?
Well, the merger case went through. The commission said, "You're right. It is not a threat to the other modes of competition." And so they basically concluded that in the real world, the railroads and barge lines didn't really compete. Now, they did at the margin, but we discovered when we tried to put joint deals together with the railroad, if the railroad could control where the freight was going to go in the first place, why would they cut their rate to force it over to the barge company? Because the market was going to set the rates for the barge company. And so, and I don't know, I still remember playing golf down at Ingram. General counsel, and he was still wanting to argue the case because he felt like we never figured out how to make it work. But he's a good guy, but we would have never agreed. We tried like the Dickens to make it work. There were some advantages in communications. I mean, everybody would lay their numbers on the table, but and we would try to cooperate. There were some, they would call it friction cost between modes being put together. You're seeing that play out now with the East-West Railroad mergers. There is some friction. That's when railroads operate under one flag as opposed to being doing interline rates.
Yeah. So Mike, this is a good time, I think, to move on to another item I wanted to ask you about, because I think it indirectly affected after CSX had bought ACBL, and all the rest of us were sure that we were all going to go out of business, and this was the end of the world for the barge line business and everything. And to some extent, it looked like from the outside that was happening, but actually what really happened, if you could go to it, is that ACBL along the line had been wise enough to have long-term contracts, and they did a lot of planning on long-term contracts within ACBL. And then you yourself actually got involved with, I think, a gentleman we both had greatly respect, Lou Meese, and some other people that you worked with to do some of the long-term projects that ACBL had, which other barge lines did not have. And so probably, in my opinion, the competitive advantage that ACBL had over barge companies like SC&O and others is your long-term contacts. Would you want to talk about that?
Yeah, the advantage that ACBL had was just that Lou Meese was a great friend of mine. I hired him back as a consultant, and he was instrumental in us going to South America. But Lou, I'm bragging on him. He was really an unusual guy. He'd been valedictorian at Notre Dame. He came out and worked for Ashland. He was head of sales and marketing for ACBL. Another bright guy named Tom Frazier. Lou was really interesting. He had worked with some economists putting adjustment clauses in ACBL contracts. And I think the guy's name was Barloon, but he had worked with different people in the industry. I think some of the industry groups had hired him as well. But they came up with a mix and a formula. It wasn't all that complicated, but when it was nobody, at least we weren't doing it. And again, and I don't take credit for this, it predates me, but I picked up on it quick. We had contracts. We had like the big Cajun electric contract. Lou went out and grabbed up the best sites. We were actually supposed to have the site where AEP built their terminal on the Ohio River, because Lou sat down with the rail map and said, here's where you should have a terminal, here's where you should have a terminal to interface with Western Coal. And he put together, we owned the terminal, and it was a private terminal. And so that was a very good contract and very long term, good margins. Because we owned Jeff Oak, we had a 100 barge contract long term with Pillsbury. I think this stuff is all old enough. I'm not adverse to using real names. And a number of others. We also had, I think sometimes forgotten even by me, but we had a pretty substantial presence in the tank barge business. It ultimately got ugly for the same reason as the dry cargo business, but not as quick and not as bad or long. There were bankruptcies in the tank barge business too, but we again had long-term contracts, and most of them had, all of them that I can recall had adjustment clauses. So all the things that were being done in fuel management and operations efficiency and all the systems capabilities of the business was lowering the incremental cost of operations. We had these formulas that were actually accelerating the rate above inflation, or at least above our inflation. And so the margin expansion was there. And so ACBL, and I think one of the things that Joe got credit for, and deservedly so, in his career, when we became part of CSX, their big deal was earn your cost of capital. Now, any of you have enough finance training, I only know a little bit about it, but you have to have several seances to really figure the cost of capital. that always affected our bonus, and of course, we never accused them of manipulating the cost of capital to have anything to do with bonuses. But Joe's tenure with CSX, he always earned the cost of capital. And a lot of people, I mean, we bought barges for pennies on the dollar. I think some people sold pretty new barges for like $50,000 or less that were well-built jump boat barges. And I think Jim and I were figuring out from memory, but I think some of those were probably $250 at the time. I guess a barge now is $1 million or so. But that was the barges got expensive because there was no capacity at the time. So people were unloading them because parking a barge is not free. You know, leave your car at the airport, you're not driving it, but you're paying to park it. And barges were no different. So, you know, that was, again, thanks to Lou, I spent a lot of my time in my early sales days staying out of court, because sometimes people would take a flyer at you because they needed to cancel those contracts. Some of those companies were really hurting. We never bankrupted anybody that I know of, because frankly, we had to figure it out some way. I told Jim, again, for the old coots watching this, a lot of special terms started showing up in freight contracts eventually, because we were looking for ways to ease the pain for the customers, to get them to do things like load heavier, turn the barges quicker, put the barge covers on right at the elevators, and we would share those cost reductions with the customers to at least try to ease the pain for them. So that heavier loading started to become, you know, that was one of the efficiencies that the industry picked up. You know, we used to, the operations department at ACL, if you load a barge to 9 feet 3 inches, they'd make them lighter. And they could have gone down the river at 11 feet probably, but that was, you know, how people lived under rules that finally changed. And the river changed, new locks and dams and so forth. But yeah, that's a good question, Jim. And anybody that was involved in the business from the 80s and even the 90s, and then at different times since that time, lived through a very, very difficult period. But that's how ACL was able to acquire companies, because of frankly, they were priced right. We always, in the cost studies, we always looked at depreciated replacement cost as one of our sanity checks. Saying, you know, why would a depreciated barge trade it? You know, if it's going to trade at a premium, why would you pay that?
So Mike, you had long-term contracts, you had CSX, and you actually went to work at CSX, didn't you?
I did. Yeah, we had interfaced with them some. I knew. Of course, I got to know John before he was a chairman, and I think first of all, I guess we changed the structure. I was vice president of sales, and then became a senior vice president of sales, which is an excuse to pay me more. And I got a call and was asked if I'd worked on the merger case. I knew the law department and a lot of the guys that ran different departments at the railroad, including Dick. I got to know Dick Sandburn a little bit, who ran the sales and marketing arm of the railroad at that time. And so anyway, I was offered a job as vice president of sales, and it was called merchandise sales, because railroad being its size, auto sales was massive, and it was a kind of department on its own. Same way with government sales, they were a huge customer. They, you know, when they'd have a war training, they'd move whole armies across the country on the railroads. So we had a real government sales group, and so I had like 14 sales offices. and that was offered to me, and I didn't know when Joe was going to leave. I wasn't going to ask him. I had much respect for him. He was young comparatively, but not at retirement age. I told Jim the last couple of days, I said, it was very painful for me because I love that company. And, so, I went in to talk to Joe, and I said, well, I bet, I hate it in a way, but I said, I don't want to look back 10 years from now and say, I wonder what would have happened if I'd have taken that job at CSX. When I was young married, my parents gave us all the married children prints. There was a guy named Sawyer that had a print, and there was a road going over a hilltop, curved like that. And my mother said, well, we're going to give that one to Mike because he'll look at that print, and every time he looks at it, he's going to say, I wonder what's on the other side of that hill. So I told Joe, I said, I guess I'm going to take the offer to go to CSX. And I had a chance to go further than that, I think. And CSX was a very big company, and much bigger than ACBL. And so Joe and I were just talking, and Joe shook his head, and he said, well, yeah, he said, I don't know. He said, I don't know how much longer I want to do this. Of course, he lived through the downtime. And I said, now you tell me. So anyway, I moved off to Baltimore, and then after a couple, it was a great experience. They had some extremely talented people. I did learn, big companies like that, ACBL and the river industry had some extremely bright people. I always said, I'm just smart enough. I said, I don't claim to be all that smart, but I'm just smart enough to know who is. But they had some really outstanding people, I learned a lot from them. I actually learned from the railroad how to draw the curves for marginal cost and marginal revenue, which unfortunately was something that I needed some of my career, even after I went back from the railroad. But so Joe decided he wanted to retire early, and I was offered the chance to come back to ACL. As I looked at the landscape, there was a guy there, and I'm just, sorry, this is probably down in the weeds again, but I had a friend there named Mike Ward. Mike grew up in the Baltimore Pool Hall and went to Maryland and had a Harvard MBA, but he was blisteringly smart and a terrific guy, and he actually had a load of common sense. And he did end up as the chairman of CSX at one point. I went back to run ACL. We made a lot of acquisitions, and for a good part of that time, it was a lot of fun. John Snow was a good guy to work for. I was on they had a group called Unit Heads, and I was often in Richmond interfacing with the guys that ran the railroad and Sealand and the other companies. So I came back to ACL as executive vice president for a few years, but everybody knew, including, that was Joe's desire. There were some wrinkles. He had to stay a little longer than the original plan, had to do with pensions and stuff, but he was terrific and gave me this full support. And so I basically ran the company not all that long. It was a little while before I picked up direct responsibility for the terminals and the shipyard, but I was kind of around those things as well. And so yeah, it was a good move back for me, and it was closer to home. And so yeah, that was.
So Mike, just you said it became good, you guys. ACBL, which I was a part of then at that time, because you had bought SCNO. We were the first ones of the major carriers that you bought was SCNO, and we, as I said earlier, we basically ran the Missouri River. That was our forte,
Yeah.
and we quit running the Missouri River when we were bought because there was all kinds of problems that were going on over there with the government and all that sort of thing. But what are some of the other barge lines you bought? Because you guys bought a lot of things. It became the largest barge lines in the world at the time, I think.
Yes, as best I can tell, that was accurate. I wasn't sure about Russia. We actually, CSX was an interesting company. Just John Snow, I mentioned what a interesting guy John was. John did a couple of terms. He was actually chairman of the Business Roundtable, and I'll stay out of the weeds on that, but I can just tell you that is a really big deal. He used to when he walked into Bill Clinton's office, he was getting, Clinton had a birthday cake for John on it with candles lit and singing happy birthday, John. So those were the circles that you run in if you're head of the Business Roundtable. And I always said I punched above my weight, and like a lot of us did that worked for John, because of what his position exposed you to. And my CFO, we got from CSX, said one time that he went to England, and John was up meeting with Margaret Thatcher, whom I got to meet one time at CSX. He said, Jim, I think I may have met the first person I really thought I'd lose a debate to. So that was an interesting time. To come back to the question Jim asked me, when we felt like the prices were right, we bought Conti Carriers. I actually hired Bob Gardner, was running Conti. Bob was with us for several years, had a lot of knowledge. It was a cultural thing. We bought, I'm trying to think of the name of the company, a guy named Marty, and his last name is escaping me. Co-op out of Kansas City had a bunch of barges that we bought. I think it said a barge line. We bought Valley was the biggest one of those, and that was interesting because we said we also bought, like Jimmy Hines' tank barge operation, and we bought some other tankers along the way as well, very small operations. And the Valley acquisition was, we said that would be more of I treated it like a merger rather than an acquisition, which meant that it didn't mean that we got rid of all of their people and kept all of our people. So as best we could, we did some cherry picking based on who did we want to keep. Actually, I mentioned Dan Markowitz earlier. Dan is an outstanding guy. And so Dan came over, and I gave him basically the three main operating departments reported to Dan, and Dan reported to me. But I as a, he was a significant CEO. I tried to, I think he actually used those terms when he left the company, but I tried to work with him more than he worked with me more than for me. But ultimately I was in charge, and I guess we both knew that. But like I say, I thought it was a good working relationship, and that's when Jim Farley came over, and so I mean Jim Fox, very very knowledgeable guy with deep background. He came to the company through Sioux City and New Orleans, and and I've got in my notes to talk a little bit about corporate cultures, because I was really sold on the importance of that. I quoted one of my favorite Thomas Sowell quotes yesterday talking to Jim. Sowell famously said that all men are created equal, but all cultures aren't. And that applies to corporate America as well as it does to nations. And but anyway, excuse me, that there was a real benefit to that, I think, to the company. Yeah.
So the barge line industry, even you came back, I think, Mike, around 89 or something like that, maybe 90, and then you became president, executive vice president, all that sort of thing, and there was a lot of things going on. But One of the other key things, you'd mentioned another Jim, you didn't mention his last name. I think his name, it wasn't Jim Fox, but it was another animal called Jim Wolf, I
Oh,
think was
yeah.
his name. And
Yep.
I think between Jim Wolf and yourself and Lou Meese, you guys somehow figured out how to try to go into South America. Would you want to talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit?
Yes, yeah, thank God you're here, Jim. Well, we might be in California by now, but, and I've gotten more so as I got older. I thought I'd calm down a little bit, but, yes, the barge business was very soft. Frankly, we, and frankly, ACL, I think, was pretty close to being without sin when it came to barge building, because I had a lot of people say, well, you are building some barges. We built a few. We never, and I don't think in my tenure as CEO, built for growth. We scrapped a lot of barges, partly because we had been an acquirer. And so we had a lot of stuff falling off the table and didn't feel compelled to replace all of those. But I remember telling the CSX people, we need to build some, and it did happen. Our cost was eventually went up because the average fleet went up in age. So, but I was at a meeting, a bunch of CSX people. It was one of these transportation things, and I got a call or a note from Jim Hagan, Hagen, who ended up, he was at CSX while I was there, but ended up as chairman of Conrail. No relation, I'm Hagan. And he said he'd gotten a call from a guy that was looking for some barges, and he said, I have a feeling that this was for you. And it turned out to be a guy named Ron Schutz, that he's departed now, but I really like working for Ron. He's a pain in the butt and smart, and he was a great entrepreneur. And they were looking for some barges to do some stuff on the Orinoco River. And I said, well, we aren't so much in the business of selling used barges, but I got hooked up with this guy because, yeah, he had the wrong Hagan. But he told me what they were trying to do. And so it was kind of still up in the air for them because there's a lot of capital. And he had a fellow, and I guess we could mention Roberto's name, right?
Sure.
A guy named Roberto Wellish. Actually, Schutz met him. This is why people go to the big soiree in Switzerland every year. That's where he met Roberto, who was a commodities guy, actually worked for Mark Rich, and had at one point run all the oil trading out of Venezuela. So he was, which is absolute requirement, I learned, to do any business offshore. But we ended up talking to them, and I had brought Meese back as a consultant because Lou had taught himself so much about coal. He built Hall Street for ACL, and then he built the big coal terminal with Florida Progress. I think FPL, I think that was him.
Yeah.
Jeff Rankin ran that business, for those of you, again, that have been around that long. But Lou had designed and built that coal terminal, and plus he was just a magnificent deal guy. He had such a retentive mind. He was like an old bull, and he had one of the finest wine collections that you ever got to sample in your life. And I got Lou to come back to work for us. And so I took this stuff back to Lou. I said, Lou, this is I said, it sounds kind of interesting. I said, we ought to take a look at it. And so I had him, he was the deal guy anyway. And so Lou started talking with Schutz and met Wellish, and one thing led to another. And we ended up with a contract with Wellish and Schutz, a guy that had kind of like Coast Guard connections, and a guy that had not barging per se, but had river operations and was well connected. Actually, it was a guy from Greece that operated on the Orinoco River. So those guys were all minority partners. They all were very helpful in maneuvering. And I'm going to go ahead and say the rest of that. We use Baker McKenzie for legal stuff. And I said the first rule of all of this is that the CEO does not go to jail. So we were very, very pure about how we operated in Venezuela. And again, the trick to that is you bring somebody in the business that they need, and we did that. Some of that actually we stumbled into, but it worked out. So we began moving bauxite on the Orinoco River, and it was very interesting. We were very conservative in our assumptions. We demanded letter of credits or we ain't coming. It was a typical Loomis contract. And it was a lot fancier contract because you had multiple currencies that were involved. So you had to worry about U.S. inflation and particularly on the capital base. But barges were well under depreciated replacement cost in value. And so we moved them down on submersibles. I've got a plaque from CSX down in my basement. I actually got an award for, they call it chasing the cost of capital. And it shows a big submersible leaving New Orleans, the first one, I think it was 1993. And the business kept getting better and better. And again, I can't help myself. I told Jim, we hired a guy named Oscar Kurth, who his father had actually worked at Bungay. He was Dan Marquitz's boss. And Oscar ran the El Cerrone project for Exxon down in Colombia. And he actually also ran Lou's coal terminal, New Orleans. So he knew something about barging. So Oscar also was fluent. He left Argentina when he was 12 when the Perones came in. So Oscar was sitting on one side. We had a big soiree in, I guess, Jim, that had been probably Port Ordaz, you reckon?
It was Port Ordaz, yeah, with CVG.
Yeah, so Oscar sitting on one side and a woman is doing simultaneous translation, and they had also a female was speaking. She was involved in a consortium of companies that were developed to use natural resources in Venezuela, which in this case was bauxite. And we moved it down where they converted to alumina. And so she's talking about this great project and this wonderful contract they've signed with this American company who's the top experts in the world. And they've saved us so much money. And she even gave the numbers. And I leaned over to Oscar and I said, Oscar, we didn't charge enough. So, but yeah, it was a very good business. And then guys like Jim got involved, and I mean, we so vastly exceeded our operating assumptions in terms of, I mean, the operating ratios on the business were crazy, and it was a partial year operation because it was I call it an unimproved. There were some buoys, I guess, Jim, and I don't think they ever did any real dredging to speak of.
They didn't. It was 7 years. You'd work 7 months at best, and I always told the story yesterday, Mike. I was teasing you that we really did it the right way. We brought in American trainers, we brought in American ways of doing things, and we trained the Venezuelans. And then during the down season, we'd bring in the U.S. and let them ride on boats and send them to the school there and that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, we had all these cowboy pilots on the boat, and these Venezuelan captains and pilots got to be so good. They didn't realize that there were a lot of captains in the U.S. that wouldn't even touch the size tolls they were taking.
Yeah.
But they just became expert people because of the American training. And that really contributed. It took a lot of vision to understand that. And I give you and Jim Wolf and Norb and everybody a lot of credit for that. Marty Pepper.
Yeah. Yeah, we were, actually, there was a huge battle within CSX, a guy that, again, to this day, we lost him, I think a year ago, but the CFO at CSX, he was adamantly opposed to going down there because of its third world operation. He said, you're gonna have trouble, you're gonna end up focusing on nothing else, and you're gonna be having a small operation, taking all the time and management away from the small operation, from the big operation. And actually, we told Jim, there's one thing we couldn't get done that we said, we won't do this, and I think it had to do with advance payments. And there was another thing at the Greenbrier, and I was talking to John Snow, and we called the whole deal off. It was actually a coal rodeo, and some barge rats will know what that is. It was always at the Greenbrier for coal industry. And I talked to John, he said, I hear you're not going. I said, yeah. He thought we were, maybe that the company was too conservative, meaning CSX, and he gave me permission to pursue it, really hung armor off. But actually, I knew where he was. He was in the old White Club, and I went sprinting down the hallways of the Greenbrier and found Lou, and I said, hey, can you turn that deal back on? And Lou said, what the hell is going on? And I told him about my conversation with John, and so after there, we were off to the races. So, but Jim's point is really a good one for anybody in business. The skill set that the pilots had were an enabler, and they became much better pilots, I think, and better managers, because you get to throw somebody into a place like that. You got to have some survival skills. I'm not talking about people shooting at you, but you had to work with the cross-cultural and so forth. A lot of people, we hired local, a lot of people, and it's interesting, quality training and all that came later, but those people, a lot of them became extremely loyal to ACBL.
Yeah, and so the international business, that portion of it did really well. We had some in the Dominican did well. We had an operation even in Argentina that probably didn't do quite as well as we'd hoped it would. But the good thing about Argentina is, Mike, that's when you learn most of your Spanish, wasn't it?
That is correct.
Yeah. So you want to tell that story about what Spanish you learned in Argentina?
Well, we're kind of cutting across country here, but I still remember I was so adamant, cautious, I guess is the word, and wasn't really cautious to go off to Argentina, especially when there was one of the things I was told, this doesn't work, it's your job. And I said, I was looking for one when I got this one. But I said, we can't do the next deal unless we can do very successful in the first deal. And that worked out great. And it was really throwing off a lot of cash. And so we started looking and say, okay, now where? And we actually did use some consulting, and we started looking, first of all, we said, who's got rivers that would support navigation? And the obvious answer, the second target really worldwide, was a so-called Southern Current cone, the Paraguay River system. I guess it was Jim's a Paraguay system. I always, after I wanted to interchange the two.
Right.
But that river system started up at the Pantanal, largest freshwater swamp in the world, and wound its way down ultimately to the ocean, but went by Buenos Aires. And there was already navigation. There was ship traffic up there for, I don't know what, Jim, 900,000 miles.
Yeah.
That might be Brazil I'm thinking about. But there was
one of the other problems, Mike, it wasn't just one country either. You went through several countries when you were navigating, so you had all these rules and regulations different than Venezuela.
Yeah, Brazil on one side, on the upper reaches, and Bolivia on the other, down through Paraguay on both banks, and then back into Argentina, and then that other river system that flowed in a place called Confluencia, if I remember right.
Yeah.
They don't more Spanish. But that ran up to the Iguazu Falls in Brazil. So I was around all these Spanish speakers. Actually, Cargill wanted us to look at that river system also, and wanted us to buy a little railroad that ran from over in Bolivia and terminated at the river because they were wanted to develop grain elevators along there. And so they were interested as a customer for us to get us to go down there and they'd already seen us operate and were very much aware of what we were doing in Venezuela. So, and we had partners down there, and I went back to the partners one day and I said, well, and I always felt bad because I knew no Spanish, and I'd be sitting in meetings and the locals would be dragging along trying to speak English, and some of them were very, very fluent. They bounced from Spanish to English to Italian, especially when I got to working with Felipe and those guys. But I actually went with the Cargill guys to go dove shooting. And so I went back to the potential partners, and I'd apologized to them before for not being able to speak Spanish. And I said, well, I've increased my Spanish capacity by 50%. Because you'd have a bird boy that would be, you'd shoot and put your hand down, you'd put 2 shells in there and you'd shove them back in the gun. Doves were everywhere, you'd shoot again. And I'd put my hand down. And this guy, at one point, I put my hand down and nothing came. And I looked at him, we made eye contact, and he was looking up at me, and he was sitting on a stool. And he said, no más cartuchos. And I said, no más, Roberto Duran, no más, no more cartridges. I said, we're out of bullets. And he shook his head up and down. So I tell the partners, I now can say agua con gas, which is bubbly water, agua sin gas, no water or no bubbles, and no más cartuchos. I had people all over South America would meet me and they'd say, no más cartuchos.
That was interesting, Mike, and I appreciate your story. I always thought that was a good story. So the South American episode came, and then the CSX process lasted. What happened after all that? How did you finish up your career? And before you do that, let me just ask you a couple of things before you finish that up, because I know one of them really means a lot to you, and it actually meant a lot to me. And I think if there was something you could pass on to future generations, this would be one of them. That I think you told me your proudest moment in the Bobzien business was introducing safety and quality into the industry.
Yeah.
And I remember clearly taking the Crosby quality classes that you and your group brought in when I went to ACBL, and I took that into Venezuela, and we taught all the Venezuelans. They did the same course and everything everybody did. Would you mind speaking to that about the safety and the quality, which I always kind of interrelated as one and the same, please?
Yeah, in preparing for this, and again, there are probably a few people that will see this and heard me speak before. And I used to have slides and all this stuff, and I never stayed on topic past the 3rd slide. So I always came back at the right time when I got embarrassed enough. So, but I had under big events, at least in my life, and I think, and we weren't the only ones in the industry to do any of this, but I had big events, and one of them was a push for improved safety. And also corporate culture, and they kind of went together. On the safety, I've mentioned Kenny Peters a couple of times. Kenny came actually to the company. His dad had been treasurer, was Joe Bobzien's boss at one time, and his dad had passed away, and that's when Joe got to be treasurer. But Kenny was a terrific analyst and extremely well organized. And he was a change agent. He was always looking out for things. And I think he was the one that actually brought it up. And the railroad had really moved post-staggers in a big way, working with railroad to improve safety also. And they made huge strides in improving the main measurement system for that was recordable injuries. And the main thing I give myself credit for was taking that as CEO, and I had the ability to, I guess, to make the decision as to how far we were going to go with it. And I jumped in with both feet. And we hired DuPont, who was foremost safety experts, I guess, in the world. The DuPont managers originally, they made gunpowder, and the managers lived on the plant site. So you can imagine how much attention the manager of the DuPont facility paid to safety. So they had a system. There's a book I read called The Fifth Discipline, and the fifth discipline was systems thinking. So you had almost all work is a part of a system, and safety clearly is not a standalone thing. You don't just go out and be safe. You have to have a system and a culture to improve safety. And that was a tough one, as was quality to get going. But they were very, very helpful. We trained everybody, and I think I can say everybody in the system. The boats, we had guys like Andy Canava and certainly Jim, Bill Hensler, guys, some of them left ACL, but I think a lot of them really bought into it. We had Jeff Boat and all the terminals, and so we really pushed it. We started recording injuries. Jerry Davis was a guy that I don't know if he went back to run the Union Pacific, but he was the railroad safety nut. He was head of all the operations at CSXT, and really great guy and smart. And I called Jerry up and I said, Jerry, I said, I don't want to start all over. I said, I need a junkyard dog for safety. And he said, let me think about it. I told him why. And so he said, I'll call you back. And he thought about it, and he called back. He gave me a guy named Glenn Holtz, who passed away a year or two ago. But he already call it the technical side of safety management, was very well steeped in it. So we stole him, just like we did Dale Walford from Texas Gas. He was our question answerer. And Glenn was you're talking about evangelical fervor, and he'd get right in your face if he felt like you weren't taking things seriously, which I really liked. I think that was one of my, if I had any strengths, that was one of them. I expected people to speak their mind. And I said, I keep this clean. I said, if I get mad at you, I said, it won't last but an hour. I said, so, tell me what you're thinking. But Glenn and a lot of people got involved. And we had a program. I mean, we had Jeff Boat, and I can still see some of these guys at the shipyard. We had a program called TOTS, Tap on the Shoulder. And we trained some of these guys that were not exactly shrinking violets physically and otherwise. And if they were doing something that was, we talked about unsafe acts. They weren't just injuries, they were unsafe acts. And so you go up, you're a 150-pound welder, and you see some guy out there who weighs about 250, and you see him doing something stupid. You're supposed to go tap him on the shoulder and say, hey, you're going to get yourself hurt, maybe one of us hurt, and it's going to cost all of us because, injuries are expensive. And we had people that were actually doing that. And as far as I know, nobody ever killed another guy for doing it. I don't even think there were any fights over it. But it was really, and that's where I was yammering on about culture. But you really had to change the culture. And part of that was to convince the average, call it frontline employee, that you actually cared whether they got hurt or not. And I gave talks. I said, hey, I'm standing up here telling, I said, you guys got families, and I actually don't want any of you to get hurt. But I said, if you think I'm full of it, that's okay. Maybe I am. But I said, injuries cost money. I said, we're a whole lot better off with you being healthy and not getting yourself hurt, besides all the other things that we're concerned about, and we do care. And so they understood that. So,
Yeah, I thought that was just an interesting concept, Mike, when you told me that that was one of your proudest moments, because obviously through all this podcast, you've been involved in many, many things and done a lot of things. So tell us, Mike, kind of how after you and I, we didn't lose contact because we would meet and everything,
yeah,
but I was kind of out of the day-to-day side in the U.S. because I was still in Venezuela working when you finally retired and finished
yeah.
your career.
Uh, yeah, one thing's because I have talked so long, so much stuff, but I know Tim can edit this down. Do you have anywhere you need to be? Because I feel like I'm committing a mortal sin if I don't mention. The other thing that was so important to me was that quality improvement, and that tied in.
Oh, yeah, please.
So, um, that movement was started, and actually my first exposure to it was, from a customer. We did a lot of business with Monsanto, and the larger companies were starting to have quality programs. There was a big move from consultancies across the United States, and frankly, it was a great. A lot of people overused consultants, or there was a lot of DS that the consultants were putting out, but they also put out a lot of really good stuff, and you had to sort through it. So anyway, we were being told by Monsanto, in a word, they said, we feel like if you don't have a quality improvement process firmly in place, that within 5 years, you won't be doing business with us anymore. Oh, really? So then they started giving us examples of, they had these CAT teams, or quality improvement teams. That doesn't work out alphabetically, but they had process improvement teams. And they gave an example of something really stupid that they were doing at a plant on the Tennessee River, and they've been doing it for years. And they started working with these process improvement teams, and they discovered these problems. And so Ray Greenwell ran our tank barge group, and so Ray came to tell me about what Monsanto was telling him, told him about this quality improvement team. And my reaction then, being open-minded like I am, says, if they've been doing those dumbass things all those years, they ought to all been fired. And so that was kind of the way I thought about things. So so I went to a meeting with Monsanto, and one thing led to another. And there was a guy named Phil Crosby that wrote a book called Quality is Free. And he had, here's that word again, a system for quality improvement. His definition, they had all these truisms, but one of them was the quality means conformance to requirements. It doesn't mean the difference between a Rolls Royce and a Volkswagen. In those days, say a Beetle. Quality is meeting customer requirements, agreed upon customer requirements. And there are a lot of other measurement things and systems in quality. And really, it was an eye opener for me. And I began to realize how much waste, your waste, fraud, and abuse. I think that was one of my problems with the Doge teams, that those guys are 10 times smarter than I am, or probably anybody, maybe other than me. ACL, it is a process, and you had part of the cultural change was to have people say, look, nobody knows everything. I mean, we'd have people rebel in the business. And one of the things I saw was all those dumbbells up at Ohio River or Sioux City or wherever, Ingram or wherever else. I mean, we're so much better than them. And what are they going to teach us? I love benchmarking. I always told the other CEOs, I said, I'll give you any operating. We couldn't talk about rates and stuff like that. Again, CEO does not go to jail, but we were able to benchmarking, and you can decide what, but we shared openly information. We always figure if somebody else would work with us, we would get better faster, and then the two of us would go beat up on everybody else, but it was still going to be free and open competition. So I learned, I lost a lot of my arrogance with with the quality process, realizing that really, if you applied those quality principles, we did, and that fit with another thing that I learned about was corporate change. We used a number of consultants for corporate change and culture. We actually hired a PhD for our human resources department, a lady named Diane. We took a lot of tests. The senior management level took things like the Myers-Briggs test, and if you've never read about it, go read about it. We take the Myers-Briggs test. It's almost like going to confession. I'm a Catholic, and my wife goes. Anyway, we go. But we would, in some of our management meetings, we would share the results of those and told you about how people like to think. Some people were visual learners, and I mean, a lot of it was borderline. It was personal, but we did a lot of that kind of stuff to improve corporate communications and openness. I went to seminar. I looked him up this morning. If you haven't, there was a guy helped found Disney University. I went to a seminar that I was invited to by AT&T that also changed me. They had some of the world-class thinkers about corporate culture and change. This guy worked a whole lot with Jack Welch. He helped Apple. Steve Jobs hired him to work with Apple on Apple culture. So we were doing some of that kind of stuff. A lot of it concurrent with safety, and so I think that people were more open. We had everybody in the company. We worked with Burlington Industries. We changed the language and some of the quality system. We call them OFIs, or opportunities for improvement. But we're pushing out, trying to tell employees, you need to be involved in the process of making this company better. Management doesn't have all the answers. So we put in people's annual goals to come up with so many quality improvement things. And I mean, I had to submit them. One of them I submitted was to change that blame headers on spreadsheets, because after you rolled up to the fourth line in the spreadsheets, you didn't know what the column said at the top. And they actually were able to do that. But I still remember that was one that I added. So that, I mean, it could be something as simple as that to some major change in some operational procedure. So that was the thing with the Valley acquisition. There was some cross-cultural stuff, but it also had allowed us. We went, when we bought Valley, we increased our capacity about 38% and took the pre-acquisition G&A down 40%. That's not the combined Valley and ACL. That was pre-Valley versus post-Valley capacity. And a lot of these systems, I think, allowed us to be able to end up making that work. And now some of that stuff we did was working. I know Marquis, when he was there, was involved in some of that. So everybody got trained. Everybody submitted their OFIs, and we actually put a full-time vice president. One of my greatest sins was letting him get away from us, but a guy. We actually had a VP for quality improvement. It was one of the things I told the railroad, because we got a lot heavier involved in that than they did. I said, don't put some guy that you don't know what you're going to do with him. Say, well, we don't really want to let him go. We're going to put him over quality. If you're going to do that, forget it. That tells everybody that you're not serious about it. And we put a full-time guy, and I was adamant about not adding staff if it absolutely wasn't necessary. But but putting that process in place, that helped the safety process. The safety process helped everything, made it a better company. And anyway, it was good. We trained on all that stuff in international operations, right, Jim?
Yes, sir, we did. And Mike, I do see why it's your proudest moment. I didn't know the full detail, but I do remember it's actually QIT, the quality improvement teams, what it was. But Yes, and I can tell you, I honestly saw it change the culture of ACBL myself. I mean, you could just see it, and especially when you were bringing in all these other companies and all these other cultures into it. And there was the old ACBL culture that this is how it was done because we've done it this way,
Yeah,
and
oh,
it
yeah,
changed that whole thinking of that thing, Mike. It
oh, yeah.
absolutely did. Yeah, absolutely did. So, so. I'm glad you went into the quality thing. I didn't mean to cut you off. I apologize.
No, that was the long,
So,
part
so
of the
that,
job is to
like I was
keep
saying,
motivated.
I was in another continent when you finished your career. So you want to just tell us how?
Well, yeah, the truth is, of course, we were sold, CSX. I said there's no more frightening couplet in the English language if you're running a division for a major corporation than financial engineering. And that's a horrifying term. And so CSX bought Conrail. They bought half of Conrail or part of Conrail. They tried to buy it all through a reverse merger. And again, I'll stay out of those weeds, but they they ended up paid an extremely high price. A lot of people thought, but I do think Conrail got pretty much all the blood out of the turnip. But I do think also, though strategically in the very long run, it was the right thing to do for CSX. I will say the early years of that acquisition were pretty painful. But in any event, they ended up deciding to go really whole hog back into that railroad business. So they divested us and City Venture Capital Corporation, which was a part of Citibank, owned a company called National Marine. I had tried, not I with my money, but National Marine, we had tried to hire them. They had a tank barge fleet, they had terminals, they had a bunch of old equipment, but not much new. They had been owned by venture capitalists. That was an interesting experience. I will say the people at Citibank were extremely bright, um, uh, but it was a different world for me. And my job was to sell ACBL or ACL, and so we talked to a lot of companies. Again, I think any kind of even just politeness. I mean, naturally, anybody in the river business, we call it. Snow asked me one time, he said, "How you been doing?" I said, "Well," I said, "I'm just got used to putting on my tutu and my long stockings and going out and doing pirouettes and doing dancing in front of a bunch of people sitting around a big table." And he said, "That's pretty graphic." I said, "Yeah, but that's how your whole management team at the barge company feels, but we'll survive it." I mean, it was really, it wasn't any fun, but we were constantly doing presentations and certainly Ohio River looked, Ingram looked, a lot of deal shops looked. And so we end up selling it into a very complicated capital structure. Back in those days, there was a company called Wasserstein Perella. Bruce Wasserstein was known as Bid 'em Up Bruce. And so we were a company, the fleet, certainly a lot of what we owned was old because of the way it was acquired. The business was in the doldrums, and we were sold. China ran out of grain back in about 2000. I told Jim about the term cork to bobbin. Um, the business was pretty ugly, and all of a sudden, I said something's going on. The Chinese were buying before they surfaced. They were buying as much corn as they could buy because they had crop failure. And so the rates shot up. I had told the salespeople, don't sell nothing because we're going to lose our butt on it. There's no margins in it. It's right at marginal cost. I said, this time we really will tie up. Of course, the problem with that is it always spurred everybody else to build again. But it had been pretty ugly. So we made 120 million in operating earnings or something. And that's when we went up for sale, and it took a while. But 2 years after that, I guess, but the business had gone like this, and it was doing a slow glide. We had lost an engine already after just 1 year, and I really thought it would take much longer than that. But in any event, City surfaced, and they ended up buying it, again with a very complicated deal structure with multiple different layers of preferred stock and common stock, and where it left a CSX supposedly would get a payout down the line, and the business just kept getting worse. Again, for those of you as customers are in the barge business, one of the guys that came aboard at ACO eventually had run Aetna. He was an old Citibank guy named Dick Huber. He was on our board for a while, and he said one time, he said, "I've never seen a business that had so many externalities: hurricanes, high water, low water, ice." Why Fox and I look so old, but anyway, it just wouldn't get better. We ended up having to file bankruptcy. That was a low point in my career, for sure. And then Sam Zell, who was a brilliant guy, they were buying up the junk bonds for ACL. Again, there was a lot of financial engineering with Sam and his group, but they ended up having control of the unsecured debt at ACL and ended up ultimately acquiring the company. All the trade, anybody that was owed money by ACL would have gotten, unsecured creditors would have gotten ACL stock. And as luck would have it for me, it wasn't a year. I remember telling Sam on a couch, he said something about, I said something about God giving up trying to predict when the business was going to get better. And he said, "Well, you haven't been very good at it, have you?" It's the only time I got, you know, I bristled. I'm pretty friendly, but also anyway. So I flared with Sam. I said, "Well," I said, "Sam, I'm not going to get in the peeing contest with a guy that's supposed to have $6 billion. I said, all I'll tell you, I said, this business will turn around. And I said, when it does, I'm guaranteeing you a bunch of people will be standing around with their hands in their pockets saying, man, I didn't see that coming." Yeah. Well, all the barge scrapping, we helped scrap yards get built because we knew it had to happen someday. And, you know, the economy got out of the doldrums. All of a sudden, all the other commodities were moving. And, you know, commodity markets turn on a dime. And again, all commodity markets are made right at the margin. And that last bushel of freight or last car sold or all that stuff will affect pricing in a dramatic way. And so many barges got scrapped. I called it the zombie fleet. There was a lot of junk running that shouldn't have been. So the industry right-sized. But like I say, it happened too late for me, but it wasn't too long after I left the business. And so probably enough said about that. I was offered by people we had worked with a job, but quite honestly, I was pretty burned out. Certainly the bankruptcy was difficult, and there were other situations with me. One of the fellows, there was a job I often wish I had taken, but been running a totally different kind of business with the owner. It was a sizable business. We had some relations with him and some of his side but major businesses. But I decided I wasn't ready. If I didn't have to work, you know, I couldn't buy an airplane that I always wanted. But so I ended up, ACL divested some things, including the South American operations. And I ended up on the board of the acquiring company. They had actually been our partner, but we were trying to rationalize the business. Part of what, when we were in trouble with the U.S. operations, we didn't have deep enough pockets to make the Southern Cone business work. And so that ended up being sold off. You know, Venezuela was sold off and Jim was running through the numbers. that was almost an expropriation, but ACB or ACL was, I think, pretty well paid, right, Jenny, for that?
Yes, they were.
So that was a home run from beginning to end, but the other business was difficult. And I ended up on their board, which was fun for me, and that was some intellectual stimulation. And again, I bought a small business that my daughter-in-law and son run, and so and I have a farm which is you speak French, don't you? Jim?
Si je veux, oui, oui, si je veux, je peux pas français, oui.
I should have called you. I called a friend of mine at the Mississippi River Museum when I bought a farm. I said, I had a friend that had Buffalo Pass Ranch and Elk Pass Ranch. He was an ex-Cargill guy. And so I needed a good name for my farm. It's down below Louisville. So I called a lady up there I knew spoke French. I said, I need the French word for redneck. She said, it's courage. It said, not literally, but close. It's a red-breasted parrot.
Yeah.
So my farm down here in Kentucky for deer and turkey hunting is Courage Farm or Red. So that's what I've done with a lot of my time since I retired.
Yeah, like Baton Rouge, only
Yeah.
Cougars. Mike, you have any last minute thoughts about, well, and Tim, I'm sure you have a couple questions, but do you have any last minute thoughts for Tim's generation and stuff? I know that I reflect back on a lot of things you said and a lot of things I forgot about, but a lot of battles have been fought over the time we were in the good ones, the bad ones, and at the end of the day, the river ran through our bloods and we gave our careers to the barge lines. So
Yeah, well, I feel like I would be pretentious, and again, I'd have to, when you've had ups and downs, but a pretty good career, and then having to take a company in Chapter 11, you know, a lot of people got hurt, at least for the interim. I mean, we actually, I mean, Sam Zell was, I have zero to say bad about Sam. I mean, I knew at some point, I was actually a CEO for a long time, and you know, the half-life, you know, especially nowadays, is not that long. And I had the job a lot longer than most. And as I say, I was burned out too. I needed to move on. I think somebody else had a chance to do a much better job with more energy than I did. And but at the risk of being pretentious, some of the last stuff that I talked about, I mean, one of my learnings, I knew systems. I mean, I can tell you a little bit about how a computer works. I mean, and I mean, some of my background's why I won't buy Bitcoins, but I have no idea. I've tried to figure out a little bit about blockchain, but so. But one of the things in my career, I realized at one point that I was assuming things about what was practical to be done, even within ACL, practical to be done with computers, and because I knew about computers, I knew enough to be dangerous. I mean, I drove the railroad computer department nuts because I'd ask him questions and he'd say, what the hell's this sales guy asking those questions for? But my learning from that, I had all those bromides that Jim knows about. Some call it Haganisms, but I try to give attribution. But Mark Twain famously said that it ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble, it's what you know that ain't so. And
yeah.
Anybody listening to this, particularly younger managers, you know, be careful, because the world, if you sit, you know, Aiden Adams at the railroad used to say, keep doing what you've been doing, you keep getting what you got. So you have to be open to change, because it's going to happen whether you like it or not. And so don't get behind. You need to be a lifetime learner. I will say that one book is probably still relevant about systems thinking, you know, the fifth discipline. Read a lot of business books, and use consultants. A lot of people think that's a waste of money. I mean, one of my dearest friends was Frank Mincer. Frank was a consultant that helped us
Right guy.
downsizing. I had a guy at Marriott tell me Frank's the only guy I ever met that had a photographic memory. He might have been smarter than me. His name was in Snow, but Mincer was a real talent. But part of what he brought, because they consulted for all these companies, and he brought all that learning into the ACL, and we got to be good personal friends, and which continued on well after my retirement. So always seek outside advice. These guys like that founded Disney University. I mean, some of that had a profound effect on how I thought about employees and how you interface with employees.
I'd ask for one more tidbit I've always admired about you, Mike. Why don't you tell your story about hiring smart people?
Well, that's pretty easy. Yeah, I told Jimmy, I said, I think my key to success was never hire anybody as dumb as I was. And I told a number of young managers, I said, and I'm a hell of one to be given advice, but I said, when you do your job, I said, you do the best job you possibly can. And then you make sure the people that report to you learn their jobs as best they can. And I don't claim purity on this, but I said, and make sure they know how to do as best they can your job. I said, because it would be a shame someday if the senior management group sitting around the table says, well, we would like to offer Paul this job. It'd be a nice promotion for him. But good Lord, we don't have anybody that knows that department, and it's critical. And right now is a bad time, and we just can't afford to let Paul move to this new job. And I said, Paul needs to make sure everybody understands that he's got really good people. And if you pull him out of there for a better job to take his next challenge, everything is going to be just fine. And that may be an exaggeration, but I've seen it play out before in corporate life. So if that would be one piece of advice. And you got to have a mindset. I know I'm good. Well, they said you've gone to talking to preaching, but I mean, people, I said, don't sneak around when somebody calls you and offers you a job. I said, go talk to them. I said, we don't own you. And so if you get an offer and you like it, we like to keep you. And I said, that's probably arrogant to ask you, but talk to us. If you're unhappy, we'd like to know about it and see if there's something. I said, a lot of things are timing. We'd hate to lose you, but go talk to them. I said, there's no repercussions to that. I said, just go ahead. I said, don't worry about it. And I think I felt like I always operated that way. At least I wanted to.
Yeah, you always were open-minded like that, Mike. Yeah, and I really appreciate you taking the time again, Mike. I know we've spent quite a bit of time here, and we've done it this week, but I've enjoyed it, Mike. I always appreciated your leadership. And Tim, I'll turn it back to you, and I do thank you, Tim, again. I think you obviously see what maybe I felt about why this interview might be worthwhile.
Absolutely. And thank you both again for your time today. Mr. Hagan, I know your wife popped in just a little while ago. Do you have time for just a couple more? I know we're coming up on 3 hours here.
Yes.
Well, kind of random, totally disparate questions that are unrelated to the bulk of what we've discussed. You made a comment earlier that you were aboard a seaplane flying under the bridges in New Orleans. I'd love to know a little more about that.
I've got lots of war stories, and at least the best I can, they're all true. But I felt very fortunate. I had a lot of variety in my career. One of the jobs I had, I guess, was assistant to a big customer of ours wanted to. We had a fleet called West Wego in West Wego, Louisiana. They wanted to expand Continental Grain Elevator, double the capacity, and they wanted our fleet. That was a dilemma. We needed property. Baton Rouge to below New Orleans, there wasn't a whole lot of suitable river property, which you know about in your job. So again, Hagan, Continental, West Wego fleet. I had substituted working in New Orleans and ran the, on like vacation relief and stuff like that. So I knew something about it, and I dispatched the area a little bit, and so, and I was flexible. So my job was to figure out how, without us taking a bath, we could exit that fleet. And it was, I'll spare all the complications, but fleets are not just about length. It was also about width. How many barges wide could you go in any particular stretch of river? Some of our fleets, you could go more barges on the upper or lower end than you could on the other end. You know, about that ship navigation and tow flotillas and all that stuff. So the guy named Sonny Ivy ran the Gulf Coast, and I had more business background, and I had the customer relations with Continental, and to some extent, and so we were looking for property, and so a guy named Captain Mac McKinney was a friend of ours. Mac ran some fleets for us, and he was actually building a boat north of Lake Pontchartrain on a shell pile. So Sonny and I and a seaplane pilot went looking, and Sonny knew that he was a terrific boat pilot for his career, and then he was in the office as a manager. But he knew every eddy. Again, those aren't in the business of anything, but I know you'll understand. When you look at a nice, serene-looking stretch of river and say, man, that'd be a great start for a fleet, except there's a massive eddy that'll take your fleet that's supposed to be straining against wires downstream, and they'll turn around and they'll move upriver, right? So anyway, we chartered a seaplane, took off on the intercoastal east of New Orleans. I still remember that guy's flying in with cranes out in the canal, and he banks that thing and goes like that around, still trying to get altitude. And so off we go. And so he gets over downtown, and you end up in the flight path for Moisant, the New Orleans International Airport. So he goes like that, and he's flying right on the deck. And so we went under, and of course, the people haven't done this. Those bridges are really high, so it wasn't as daunting as it might sound. So I don't want to embellish the story, but we flew under all those bridges. But I remember passing ships, and he was having to bank because the ships were higher than we were flying along the river.
Wow.
And Captain Ivy's telling me all these different points. That'd be a great spot. So we had a map, and we had to figure. Of course, we didn't have the stuff you have now to see who owned what. And we flew, and we did fly the low bridges, Upper Harbor, or the bridge up in Baton Rouge. And then we peel around, and we land on Bayou Chifunte over north of Lake Pontchartrain. The seaplane guy put that thing down on Bayou Chifunte, which is a pretty small. It was wider than the wings, of course, but not a whole lot. And the rest of that story is we went to lunch, and everybody had a beer, and the pilot had a beer, and everybody had a second beer. And I looked at the pilot, and I said, "You're done." I said, "Man, do you always drink when you're flying at Blaine?" So we didn't let him have but one beer. So that's how I ended up flying under all the bridges, was looking for land to put fleets in.
I had not heard that story.
It's always true. Captain Mac, the engine was straight. We had a leak in a pontoon. We had to pump that out. And Captain Mac heard the engine on the plane. He actually went looking for us because he thought we'd crashed into the trees. We were dragging a rope, and all I could think about was that rope, and I kept watching these trees. Rope.
And one final question. You mentioned, of course, these sort of, I don't know, CEO forums for rubbing elbows with the Ingrams and things like that.
Yeah.
Are there any stories, humorous, interesting things that have happened in meetings like that over the years?
Probably.
That might be enough said, but I'm listening.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. The kind of stuff when you're in trade associations, all that stuff, you really always have to refresh your memories. we trained everybody in the antitrust laws. So there are a lot of things you absolutely knew. When we told people, we had people read the rules of antitrust and they had to sign if they read it and understood it. One guy said, I'm not signing that. I said, doesn't matter if you sign it or not, the law is still the same. And I said, ignorance is no excuse. So if you're doing anything that you shouldn't be doing, you better quit it. And if you do, we'll fire you. So, the range of talks around things in the river business had some confines around them. I mean, in my experience, everybody was really cautious about that kind of stuff. I mean, you could still learn a lot. Like I mentioned, willing to benchmark with other people. I talk to people about that and talk about operating issues and certainly political issues. I mean, one of the things we didn't cover, and I've already been too long, but was involved in some of the stuff, kind of lobbying when the fuel tax came in. I was quoted when Bill Clinton came to office. They proposed $1 a gallon fuel tax, and the Wall Street Journal reporter called me and started asking me questions about it. And I'd been woodshedded before about talking to lawyers and the press, and so I was a little circumspect. But the quote that the guy used when I said, well, it doesn't give you a sense of the warm fuzzies when you think about a tax at that high. And I was told later by people that were there, they said that it was above the fold on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. I call that one of my Andy Warhol moments, part of my 15 minutes of fame. But they said that the people running around with a copy of the Wall Street Journal said, what in the heck is this about? And this guy talking about this severely economically damaging fuel tax. And so there's an awful lot of energy by the industry, and we all gave talks about it. And but that the industry finally acquiesced. It was coming anyway with the fuel tax, and even ended up to try to pick up the pace of improvements to the system. Actually proposed an increase of about 9 cents, I think, from 20 to 29 cents or something. I think that's where it is now, but I'm not sure. But yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of different personalities that you interface with, and you're talking to peers. I was in a situation where it was okay for me to talk about barge building, and I commented publicly that I thought the business was headed for a steep downturn. And I had a fellow say afterwards that I sure hope you're wrong about that. And I said, me too.
Yeah.
And frankly, in this one case, I actually was right. It wasn't as bad as the first one, but it was overbuilding again. But I was pretty careful. So
Is that a good enough place to stop here, gentlemen? Or Jim, did you have anything else?
No, I think I'm good, Tim. Again, thank you for the opportunity. And Mike, I truly thank you for all your time.
it's fun.
A lot of memories for me. Whew, a lot of memories back for me.
Yeah, I didn't, till I dug out some of this paperwork, I didn't know when I started working when, so where I started working when.
Yeah.
Yeah, at this age, it's a nice thing. They say you meet the nicest new people every day. So,
well, again, thank you both very much for your time this afternoon. I think 3 hours is plenty enough.
Have fun editing. Talk to you later.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Tim, thank you. Thanks, Mike. Talk to you, friend. All right, sir. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Yeah, thank you all.